This is the ROG Harpe II Ace, ROG's latest peripheral release and one that marks a new era for ROG, so to speak, who've historically had some mixed success when it comes to their peripherals. I myself have experienced this mixed success as the Keras 2 Ace I reviewed last year was a decent mouse overall, but it lacked many key features offered by competitors' mice, particularly a shell coating. As such, while there has been potential with ROG's peripherals, they weren't mice I'd recommend given the features they lacked. But with the release of the Harpe here, something has changed over at ROG HQ, as this is a mouse that genuinely blew me away. It's not perfect, but it's leaps and bounds better than ROG's previous releases in almost every aspect. And a big reason as to why this mouse is so good is because ROG swallowed their pride, something many brands would benefit from doing, and worked with pros, reviewers, and customers, gathering feedback to refine their products, and damn that paid off, as the Harpe II Ace is such a solid mouse I'm actually kind of shocked ROG made it. So in today's episode of the mel0n review, we're going to take a deep dive into the Harpe II Ace and talk in depth about the mouse's many pros, few cons, and how ROG could further refine their future peripheral releases. But before we dive in, a big thank you to ROG for sending over the Harpe II Ace for review. They were also kind enough to send over the new Keras 2 Origins as well, which I'm very excited to review now given how solid this mouse is, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that review as well as the Harpe II Ace's teardown video. And a big thank you to our channel members who make videos like this possible. If you'd like to support my efforts here with these in-depth reviews and the teardown project, consider becoming a channel member today. And as always, this review will be completely unbiased, meaning you'll get my unbiased opinion of this product and every other product I review here on the channel, with no affiliate links or paid promos or brand bias. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. For testing parameters, I used the Harpe II Ace for roughly 2 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming use on both soft and hard pad types. For skates, due to the improved stock skate design here, I actually used the mouse's stock skates for the majority of my testing, but when I tested the mouse on some hard pads, I removed the stock skates to install the X-Ray Pad U9 Ultra Dots as they were better suited for hard pad use than the stock ones were. And for firmware, I tested the mouse on version 8.00.11, the latest firmware version available at the time of this review. For versions, the mouse comes in 3 colorways: black, moonstone white, and a new lava red colorway that was recently revealed. There is also the purple colorway I have here, which is a limited Demon 1 edition for pros and influencers that I somehow got my hands on. To be fair though, I'm not complaining as I love the purple colorway, but this version won't be readily available due to its limited nature. However, it's important to note the only difference between the D1 versions and the retail versions is their shell coloring and packaging. Everything else is identical, so all aspects of this mouse aside from the ones we just mentioned will be the same as the other colorways and will represent the usage experience of a retail unit. And for pricing, the mouse retails for a rather steep $169.99 USD, which is around 240 Canadian dollars. This is definitely on the high end for a mouse price, but this is expected as ROG sits in the big boy brand pricing category along with Razer and Logitech, who've priced their mice similarly. For unboxing and accessories, due to the limited nature of my unit, the packaging here is visually different from the retail mice you'll find in store, but as mentioned earlier, all the accessories between this one and a retail unit will be the same. Now, opening the box by sliding this lid off the base, we'll find the mouse itself, which is held in place by a cardboard cutout. On the mouse's base, we'll find a set of pre-installed full-size PTFE skates, which as mentioned a moment ago, are vastly improved from the skates we've seen on ROG's previous mice, but we'll talk more about these later. Also on the base, we'll find the mouse's USB-A ROG Omni receiver slotted right above the lower skate. This is the same style of dongle we saw included with ROG's previous mice, which are unique as you can harmonize multiple ROG devices to a single receiver, which is a really cool feature we only see from a handful of brands on the market. Now when it comes to peripherals, I'm not always a fan of on-device dongle storage, but ROG has implemented a rather simplistic storage method here, which isn't intrusive and most most importantly, doesn't add a bunch of unnecessary weight to the mouse. Next, removing a cardboard cutout that holds the mouse in place, we have a little welcome card, and on the opposite side the card lists a quick rundown of the mouse's hotkeys. Under this, we have another box which we can remove from the base, which includes the remainder of the mouse's accessories, but this box is rather cool as it opens in two ways. Firstly, you can open the top of the box by pulling this tab, revealing the mouse's stock cable and its adapter. Now the stock cable here is the same type we saw included with the Harpe II Ace, which is a very good thing as ROG stock cables are actually quite good. This cable has the same A to C design and shares the same thinner, more flexible nature we've seen on their previous cables. This design makes the cable's usage astronomically better than the usage experience of most mice's stock cables we'll find on the market, but we'll talk more in depth about the stock cable and how it performs and how it could be improved later in this video. Next we have the aforementioned adapter dongle, but this is the same clip adapter ROG has included with their previous releases. This is something I'm very happy to see return here, as instead of relying on a rubber base as almost all dongles do to anchor them, this adapter has a metal clip on its base which you can clip onto the edge of your mousepad. This not only allows the adapter and the dongle to be securely anchored to your mousepad, it also ensures the dongle is in optimal position, something that a shocking amount of users and pro players ignore when setting up their peripherals. However, while this clip dongle is a great feature, out of the box the clip is very tight, too tight for many modern mousepads. As such, I'd recommend loosening the clip's tensioning screws slightly, as this will allow the dongle to comfortably clip onto most mousepad types, and this is especially important if you plan on clipping this adapter to a hard pad, as you'll need to loosen the clip quite a bit to do so. Going back to the box we removed from the base here and opening it from the bottom, here we'll find the remainder of the mouse's accessories. The first of which is a sheet of holographic ROG stickers, very similar to the ones we saw included with their previous releases. Next we have a rather familiar looking envelope which includes a sheet of grip aids as well as an extra sheet of stock skates, both of which are nice accessories to see included, and we'll talk more about them in their respective segments later in this video. We also have a rather thorough user manual which outlines all the features of the mouse, its included accessories, and more in multiple languages, which is nice to see. And lastly, we have a thick with 2C's regulatory and warranty information booklet, which outlines the terms and conditions for the mouse's 1-year manufacturer warranty, as well as all the required regulatory information. As a preface to this segment, keep in mind that my unit was sent to me directly by ROG, and seeing as this is a limited run version, take the build quality and QC of my unit with a grain of salt. For build quality, to my surprise, the Harpe is a very well built mouse, with extremely rigid base and top shells that have absolutely no creaking or flexing to them, and this is even more impressive seeing as the shell is made of a bio-based nylon, not plastic. Now the shell's rigid feel is mostly due to the internal structure, as the top shell is strengthened by a central cage-like structure, but it's also due to the sheer amount of clips that run along the sides of the shell, allowing the top and base shells to anchor to each other quite strongly, so much so the mouse can actually be a little tricky to service and take apart because of this, but we'll talk more about the mouse's serviceability later in this video. And on the topic of the mouse's internals, another thing I wanted to highlight here is that ROG has glued the top of the battery's JST connector, securing the cables and preventing them from coming loose, the same thing a Logitech did on the GPX2. Admittedly, the chance of these cables coming loose is very low, but this is a nice attention to detail regardless. For QC, again, to my surprise, the mouse is pretty much perfect, as the mouse's buttons are very well implemented, having semi-balanced click feels and actuation weights on my unit. The side buttons themselves, however, could be improved slightly, but we'll talk more about them later. And for soldering, the main and daughter PCBs are flawless on my unit, and the rest of the mouse's internals are very well designed, much better than we've seen on ROG's previous releases in my opinion. But one oddity I did notice is that inside the mouse, the sensor's lens wasn't secured. Usually, these plastic prongs are melted down to anchor the lens to the sensor, but oddly mine aren't, meaning the only support the lens has is the base shell itself. Now to be fair, the sensor lens wasn't attached on the Harpe II Ace I reviewed last year either, but this is something I'd like to see ROG address on their future releases, as the lens is a very important aspect to the mouse, and a loose lens, even if it's slightly loose, can make a mouse unusable, which is why every other brand anchors the sensor's lens to the sensor, something ROG absolutely should be doing to mitigate any potential issues on their products. For weight, the Harpe II Ace is a significantly more weight-optimized mouse compared to its predecessor, and thankfully, ROG didn't fall into the ultralight pitfall as many other brands had fallen into, as despite the mouse's improved weight, the mouse's build quality, as we just talked about, is superb. Now, ROG is advertising that the mouse will weigh 48 grams. Interestingly though, they're not advertising any plus-minus ratio on this spec, but regardless, the industry standard of plus-minus 2 grams still applies here. But to my surprise, the mouse in its stock configuration with the full-size skates and the dongle removed weighs only 48.13 grams, and without any skates the mouse weighs 45.52 grams. So not only is ROG's advertised weight here for the Harpe II essentially dead on, something I honestly didn't expect to see, the mouse is also significantly lighter than the Harpe I, which weighed around 54 grams in its stock configuration. The improved weight here on the Harpe II can be attributed to two factors, one of which is the mouse's shell, which just like some of ROG's previous releases, is made of a bio-based nylon. However, the nylon material here is lighter than the nylon material ROG has used before, and the second attribute here is the mouse's internal build, which while being a little complex is much better weight optimized than ROG's other releases, which also contributes to the Harpe II's reduced weight. For axis balancing, starting with the mouse's x-axis, as expected for symmetrical or symmetrical adjacent shaping as ROG is describing the Harpe II's shaping as, the mouse is centrally balanced, but the mouse's balance forward of its 63.05mm physical midline being roughly balanced at the mouse's 67mm mark. But unlike most mice that have balancing ranges on their x-axis, the Keras 2 is very tightly balanced with no noticeable range to it. As such, depending on where you grip the mouse, it might feel slightly forward heavy, especially seeing as the side shell's hourglass-like indentations guide your grip lower in the mouse's shell, meaning that with fingertip or hybrid grip styles, there might be a small acclimation period here in which the mouse might feel a little odd to aim with, but after a few hours of use, this odd feeling should go away. The same can be said for palm and claw users, as those grip styles will position themselves above the mouse's balancing point, also resulting in a slight odd feeling out of the box, but again, this will also go away once you've acclimated to the mouse. For y-axis balancing, as expected given the mouse's shaping, the mouse is centrally balanced on its y-axis with no bias to its left or right side. And on the topic of balancing, inside the mouse, the battery is positioned behind the mouse's physical midline as it works as a counterweight to the mouse's forward region, ensuring the mouse is evenly balanced. Meaning that if the battery is moved or modded for a larger or smaller capacity one, the mouse's balancing will be affected, so keep this in mind if you plan on battery modding the Keras II Ace. For shaping, and as mentioned a moment ago, the Harpe II Ace is a symmetrically shaped mouse which is right-hand optimized as expected, but oddly on ROG's product page for the mouse, they advertise that its shaping is both a semi-symmetrical and symmetrical shape. Admittedly, this was a little confusing at first as I haven't heard of a semi-symmetrical shaping before, but as it turns out this is an accurate description of the shell, as at the forward region of the mouse's right side, the shell is slightly more rounded at its front, and at the forward to mid region of the right side shell, it's also slightly more outwardly tilted than the opposite side. This results in the Harpe's side shell profiles differing slightly, but not enough to define the shell's shaping as asymmetrical in my opinion. As such, while this semi-symmetrical shaping is a little confusing at first, it is an accurate way to describe the mouse's shaping. For specific dimensions, for length, the mouse measures 126.1mm long. For widths, at the shell's forward region, at the top of the shell, it measures approximately 61mm wide, whereas at its base it measures approximately 58.6mm wide. At the shell's mid region, at the deepest part of the side shell's hourglass-like curvature, at the top the shell measures approximately 59.4mm wide, and at its base it measures approximately 56.9mm wide. And lastly, at the shell's rear region, at the widest part of the rounded rear curvature, the shell measures approximately 63.9mm wide. And for their heights, at the shell's forward region, right at the front region of the scroll wheel, the shell measures approximately 22.3 millimeters tall, but it's worth noting that the buttons themselves do have a much lower click height at their top region, but we'll talk more about them later. At the middle region of the shell, slightly behind the physical midline where the top shell's curvature peaks, the shell measures approximately 39.7 millimeters tall, and from the peak of the shell hump, the shell flattens, creating a slightly rounded sloping rear shell curvature, which terminates at a lip at the base, which measures approximately 5.5 millimeters tall. For shell profiles, looking at the Harpe 2 from the top, we can see the aforementioned semi-symmetrical shaping with its wider front region with a thicker right side, thinner mid region, and widest rear region that has the expected rounded curvature, the shaping we see on almost every symmetrical mouse on the market. Flipping the mouse over and looking at it from the base, we can better see the mouse's semi-symmetrical shaping as well as its hourglass-like curvature, as it is much more pronounced on the mouse's base than it is from the top. We can also slightly see the difference in the side shell's profiles, as the right side shell, left from the top, is slightly more pronounced from the left side, but we'll talk more about these differences in a moment. From the base, we can also see that while the base shell looks thinner than the top of the base shell actually widens quite a bit, melding itself into the top shell's profile without a significant curvature like we commonly see. Looking from the sides, we can best see the mouse's top shell curvature, which as I mentioned earlier is quite different from the profile of the Harpe 1, as while the shell's hump peaks in the same spot, slightly behind the mouse's physical midline, the forward shell's curvature is thinner than it was on the 1, and the rear shell profile is much shallower and less rounded compared to the 1's hump, having more of a gradual sloping curvature to it. Looking at the mouse from the front, we can best see the curvature of the top shell, which is a more rounded shaping, peaking towards the middle of the shell. This curvature also applies to the two main clicks, but due to the aggressive contouring in their surface, the main clicks look and feel flattened despite the top shell's rounded shaping. From the front, we can also best see the Harpe 2's side shell profiles, which differ slightly as mentioned earlier, as the mouse's right side, left from the top, is slightly rounded and wider at its forward to mid region compared to the left side, which causes the profile of the right side shell to be less outwardly tilted compared to the left side shell. This difference in curvature also causes the shaping of the side shells to differ too, as the right side is more flattened while the left side is a little more rounded. But while the profile of the side shells differ from each other, the shaping, while different at the forward region, match each other at the left and right side shell's mid to end region, as both side shells become more inwardly tilted at the mouse's hourglass-like indentations, then flatten out, then become inwardly tilted again to meld into the rear shell's curvature. And lastly, looking at the mouse from the rear, we can again see the rounded top shell shaping, and we can best see the more gradual curvature of the rear shell's profile here as well. For contact regions and points for my 25.4 by 10.16 cm hands using an angled claw grip here on the Harpe II Ace. Starting with palm contact, the mouse's shell makes the majority of its contact with my thenar's high to mid region and my hypothenar's mid region. The shell does make some contact with my mid palm's mid to high region, but this contact is more supportive, whereas my thenar and hypothenar's contact are the primary anchoring points for my grip style. For finger contact, starting with my thumb, when I naturally grip the mouse, my thumb naturally rests towards the left side shell's forward region, but if needed I can angle my thumb inward, resting it at the deepest part of the left side shell's hourglass-like indentation. For my index and middle fingers, due to the contoured grooving in the main clicks, they're naturally guided towards the center of both the shell buttons, and they rest toward the end region of the buttons. While my ring finger rests roughly opposite the position of my thumb in its natural position on the shell's right side, towards the right side's forward region, and lastly for my pinky finger, it rests below my ring finger, roughly at the deepest part of the right side shell's hourglass-like indentation, roughly opposite where my angled thumb would rest on the mouse's left side. But keep in mind I have very large hands and I use a tilted grip style, so the way my hands work with the mouse's shell won't be the same for everyone, but you can use the contact regions and points from my hands to estimate how the mouse's shell will feel in your hands. For the Harpe II Ace's hand size and grip style compatibility, as mentioned earlier, ROG is advertising that the redesigned shaping here is best suited for claw and fingertip grip styles, but they don't mention any specifics about what hand sizes the mouse is best suited for. But keep in mind that the mouse is right hand optimized, but due to its symmetrical nature, technically speaking the mouse can be used with a left-handed grip style, though you won't be able to utilize the mouse's side buttons with this grip style. Now for hands measuring approximately 15.2 to 16.5 by 8 to 9.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 16.5 to 17.8 by 9.5 to 10.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips as well as fingertip grips. For hands measuring approximately 17.8 to 19.1 by 10.5 to 11.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips. For hands measuring approximately 19.1 to 20.3 by 11.5 to 12.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips again. And for hands measuring approximately 20.3 to 21.6 by 12.5 to 13.5 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for claw and fingertip grips. But keep in mind this is a rough estimation, and the actual hand size and grip style compatibility for the Harpe II will vary from person to person, so if you're considering the mouse, I'd recommend measuring the length of your hand from the tip of your fingers to just below your wrist line, and the width of your hand by measuring the width of your knuckles excluding your thumb, as you can use those measurements in combination with your grip style to estimate if the mouse will be compatible with your hand size and grip style. For coating, thankfully ROG has made some major improvements here, as they've actually applied a real coating to the Harpe II's shell, something ROG oddly didn't do on their previous releases, which significantly hampered their usage and performance. Now according to ROG, the Harpe II's coating is a matte coating, however unlike most matte coatings which have a balanced feel between rubberiness and chalkiness, the coating here leans much more towards the rubberized side of the spectrum. While this isn't exactly traditional, I actually quite like the feel of the coating, as it feels almost identical to the new coating Razer used on the DeathAdder V4 Pro. This similarity gives the Harpe's coating stellar performance, as with both wet and dry hands, the shell's coating provided ample anchoring over my testing, and unlike ROG's previous mice, the coating performed so well I never felt the need to utilize the included grip aids, as the coating is on par with Razer's coating when it comes to performance in my opinion, which is a fantastic improvement coming from ROG's previous releases, and I hope going forward we see ROG use this coating on all their future releases, as it's essentially perfect in my opinion. But while the coating does perform great, just like all great coatings, the one here does collect oils, dust, and debris like a magnet does metal, which is especially noticeable on the Harpe II's darker colorways. Thankfully, this buildup never affected the mouse's gripability, but it does give the mouse a grimy look to it. You can remove said grimy look by wiping the shell with a dry microfiber cloth, but if you're particular about the look of your mouse, I'd recommend sticking to the lighter colorways, as buildup will be much less noticeable on them. For grip aids, as mentioned earlier, the Harpe II includes the same type of grip aids we've seen ROG include with their previous releases. These grips come in a pre-cut full-size set that includes 2 click covers and 2 side covers, all of which have a semi-thin form factor and ROG-themed designs across their surface. Disappointingly though, the mouse doesn't include any universal side button or hump cover pieces, something I expect to be included on a mouse of this price point. The grips themselves have the same raised flattened triangular texturing we've seen on ROG's grips before, and the grips material does have a decent degree of natural stickiness to it, which gives the grips a decently sticky feel to dry hands, but when gripped with wet hands, the grips become very slippery due to the lack of texturing. On the plus side though, the grips are somewhat reusable, meaning you can adjust their position easily, but they can warp due to their thinner form factor in some cases. As such, while the included grip aids here are good, and they are better than the grip aids included with many similarly priced mice, their performance pales in comparison to aftermarket options, and given the new coating applied to the Harpe II's shell, these grips feel quite out of place, as the coating provides ample gripability for both wet and dry hands, not just dry hands like the grips do, making these grips rather redundant in my opinion. As such, on ROG's future mice, I'd still like to see them include the grip aids, as they're a nice option to have, but the grips themselves should be updated to a modular pre-cut set that also includes universal pieces, hump covers, and side button covers, similar to what G-Wolves includes with their mice, as that is the golden standard for included grip aids in my opinion. For main clicks, despite the mouse's semi-symmetrical shaping, the main clicks are a more traditional style that you'd expect to find on a symmetrical mouse. For shaping, the buttons themselves are a rectangular shape with a rounded edge, which due to the top shell's rounded profile, are quite slanted, being the tallest towards their inner edges and the shortest towards their outer edges. But here on my unit, since this is the special Demon 1 edition, there is a D1 signature printed on the left click here, which does have a raised texture compared to the rest of the button, which can be a bit off-putting texturally speaking, but since this is exclusive to this Demon 1 edition, this won't be an issue on the retail versions as they have plain main clicks. For coating, the shell buttons share the same fantastic coating that is applied to the rest of the mouse's shell, which makes the main clicks very grippable, and in addition to the coating, both the main clicks have quite pronounced grooving or indentations in their end to mid regions, which as mentioned earlier naturally guides your fingers toward the center of the buttons and also improves the button's already great grippability, and in addition to that, this grooving also helps to flatten the button's rather slanted design, giving the main clicks a wide enough contact area for them to be easy to utilize despite their more angled nature. Another great attention to detail here is that both the main clicks are indented into the mouse's shell, but instead of having a walled indentation like we commonly see, the indentation method here is more of a gapping, similar to what we see on Vaxi's main clicks. But despite this not being the traditional indentation method, the gapping here is wide enough where both main clicks are free from any interference issues potentially caused by fingers resting against the forward side shell regions, something very important for a mouse with such universal grip style compatibility. For click heights, since the Harpe II's semi-symmetrical nature only affects the mouse's side shell profiles, both the shell buttons share the same click heights, as at their very end region the buttons are around 12mm tall, at their mid region the buttons are around 25mm tall, and at their top region the buttons are approximately 30mm tall. In terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the Harpe II's main clicks. For main click switches, the Harpe II is using ROG's custom optical switches, the same type we've seen ROG use in many of their previous releases. Now as you just heard, these switches are on the louder side, which is traditional for ROG's custom switches, but these switches might be a little too loud for some users who are a little sensitive to this, so if you're considering the Harpe II Ace or any of ROG's mice for that matter that utilize these ROG optical switches, keep in mind the higher degree of audio feedback here. Now these switches are a fully custom SKU which I assume is manufactured by mel0n or Razer, but sadly ROG wouldn't provide any manufacturer related information about these switches, so I have no way to confirm their manufacturer. But while we don't know who makes these switches, we do know their cycle rating, as just like the other ROG optical switches, the ones here have the same 100 million cycle rating, and they're rated for around a 70 gram actuation weight, which is accurate at the click's end to mid region, but at their top region the buttons are slightly heavier, feeling more akin to an 80 gram actuation weight, but this is to be expected as all mice's main clicks get heavier at their upper region. For stabilization, both the main clicks are quite well stabilized, only having a slight degree of play to them even when actuated, but due to the pronounced grooving in the button's surface, there is a slight degree of wobble to them if they're actuated on their edges, but said wobble is so slight it doesn't significantly impact the button's feel, especially seeing as the grooving in the main clicks guides your fingers toward the center of the buttons, which naturally prevents the buttons from wobbling. For travel, both the main clicks have a low degree of pre-travel and a low to medium degree of post-travel, and both the buttons, as expected for this ROG switch, do have a rather snappy rebound to them, allowing both the main clicks to feel quite tactile and very spammable. Another noteworthy feature here on the Harpe is that inside, both the main click stabilizers are pre-lubed, which is done to help prevent the main clicks from grinding. This lubing will likely last the lifespan of the mouse, but if you find your main clicks grinding or having any other main click related issues, you can simply relube these stabilizers if needed. And if you want to learn how to open the mouse to relube these stabilizers or repair any of the mouse's internal components, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the Harpe II's teardown video. And lastly, just like the switches we've seen in ROG's other products, the switches here on the Harpe II are technically hot swappable, but oddly ROG has glued down the switches. Now since ROG isn't advertising that the switches are hot swappable here on the Harpe II, I'm not going to make too much of a fuss about this, as in the future if a switch does fail, you can swap in a new switch relatively easily. You'll just need to remove the glue holding it in place, but keep in mind that these switches are only hot swappable with other ROG switch types, meaning you'll have to replace them with other ROG optical switches and you cannot use aftermarket ones here on the Harpe II, which is a little disappointing. For side clicks, the Harpe 2 uses a fairly traditional side button design, which are decently implemented, but oddly, ROG has opted not to apply coding to the mouse's side buttons, which does hamper their usage and performance. But before we talk about the odd lack of coding, let's talk about the button's position and shaping first. Now, compared to the Harpe 1, the side buttons here on the 2 have been shifted forward as they rest forward of the mouse's 63.05mm physical midline and the mouse's 67mm balancing point being centered roughly on the 70mm mark. This more forward position allows both the buttons to be accessible for essentially every hand size and grip style, which is a great improvement coming from the side buttons on the Harpe 1. For the buttons themselves, as I mentioned earlier, the buttons are a more traditional style we've seen adopted by many brands, having a rectangular shaping with an angled edge to them and a flat surface. The buttons also have a slanted edge to them, just as we've seen on Razer's side buttons, and the buttons are slightly curved to match the top shell's curvature as well. But compared to many competitors' products, the side buttons here on the Harpe are on the smaller side, but thankfully the flatness of their surface gives them enough surface area to be reliably usable. ROG has also added a sizable gapping between the side buttons here, which prevents any instances of accidentally activating the opposite side button when clicking on their inner edges, a great attention to detail that is missed by many brands when implementing their side buttons. And another great attention to detail here is that the side buttons are quite pronounced on the mouse's side shell, which further improves their usability, but as I mentioned a moment ago, for reasons that are beyond me, ROG pulled a Logitech here and didn't coat the side buttons, opting to instead make their surface a little granular. This in theory should have made the buttons grippable, but in reality the side buttons are significantly harder to grip compared to the main clicks, and the rest of the shell for that matter. And since the mouse doesn't include any side button covers, there's no way to fix the button's grippability issues without relying on aftermarket grip aids. This is by far the most baffling aspect of the Harpe 2's design, especially seeing as their new coating is leaps and bounds better than the ones on their previous mice, and their decision not to apply it to the side buttons is very confusing, as with their granular surface, the side buttons are quite slippery. To be fair though, the flattened surface does mitigate this slipperiness somehow and allows the buttons to be relatively usable, but compared to other brands' mice such as Razer, who have coated the side buttons with the same coating as the rest of the shell, the side buttons here on the Harpe stand out like a sore thumb, so to speak, and on future ROG products, their fantastic shell coating should absolutely be applied to their side buttons as well, as if the Harpe 2 side buttons were coated, these buttons would be essentially perfect, though they are on the small side in my opinion. But on the plus side, the side buttons themselves are relatively easy to remove from the top shell, meaning if you're up for some modding, you can remove them and apply coating to them yourself, but we'll talk more about the mouse's repairability and moddability later. Now in terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test of the Harpe 2's side buttons. For side button switches, the Harpe 2 is using a rather unique switch, as ROG has pulled another page from Razer's playbook here, as inside we'll find two Changfeng MS09.250W.P2B81 switches. These switches, funnily enough, are a variant of the side button switches we saw inside the Viper V3 Pro, as both the switches share the same cycle rating of 3 million cycles and the same estimated actuation weight of around 80 grams, but this is the first time I've personally seen a Changfeng switch in a non-Razer product, but I'm very happy to see them here, as I quite like their implementation on Razer's products, and I'm happy to see more brands adopt them. Now, the switch's 80 gram actuation weight does make the side buttons heavier than the main clicks, which is noticeable during use, but it doesn't skew the mouse's click feel enough where it's an issue per se, but on future Harpe models, ROG could benefit from slightly lowering the actuation weight of the side buttons here to make the mouse more well-rounded and balanced in terms of its click feel. For stabilization, the side buttons, just like the main clicks, are rather well stabilized, with only a slight degree of play to them when actuated, and for travel, both buttons have a low degree of both pre and post travel, which combined with their surprisingly snappy rebound, makes the side buttons rather responsive and quite spammable, though again the lack of coating does make the buttons rather slippery, so consistently actuating the buttons can be tricky in some cases. But, just like we've seen on ROG's previous releases, the side buttons are installed onto a daughter PCB which has an integrated ribbon cable that connects to the main click PCB and the main board. Now we've seen many brands adopt this integrated PCB design as it's more weight optimized compared to boards with a dedicated connector. However, this PCB design is much harder to service than the more traditional ones, as it's very easy to damage the integrated cable when soldering new switches. Thankfully though, the pins on these Changfeng switches are exposed, meaning it's easier to mod compared to other integrated PCBs, but be careful if you do attempt this as it's very easy to damage, and if you do damage the board, it'll render the entire top shell non-functional, so keep this in mind, and because of this I'd opt to replace the integrated PCB as a whole instead of trying to solder switches, just to be on the safe side. For scroll wheel, the Harpe II is using the same style of scroll wheel we've found on ROG's previous releases, which is a good thing, especially seeing as ROG has seemingly fixed a critical issue that has plagued these scroll wheels in the past. Now the Harpe II scroll wheel frame, as expected, is the same semi-transparent plastic, which has a gray flattened rubber texturing wrapped around it, which features a slash-like texture etched into its surface. Now on ROG's previous mice, one common fault point with the scroll wheels was the texturing itself, as it'd come loose over long-term use. Thankfully though, this appears to be fixed here on the Harpe II, as the wheel's texturing appears to be glued to the wheel itself, which will hopefully prevent any loosening issues over long-term use. And as expected for a ROG product, the wheel does support RGB lighting via a small light installed inside it, which connects to the integrated ribbon cable that runs from the top shell to the main board. Now the lighting can be configured via the mouse's driver, and we'll talk more about the mouse's lighting options and how to configure it later. Now the wheel here is positioned semi-pronounced from the mouse's top shell, which at first glance seems a little shallow, but since the scroll wheel rests in this indent between the two main clicks here, the wheel, despite how it looks, is easy to utilize, but it does have a slightly lower scroll range of 8 points compared to the 10 of more pronounced scroll wheels. For encoder, inside we'll find a rather familiar component, specifically a TGC Gold dustproof 24-step encoder, a 13mm version. This encoder, as expected, seeing as it's been used on almost every mouse this year, has a medium scroll force with semi-pronounced scroll points, which are pronounced enough to prevent the wheel from slipping when scroll wheel clicking, and gives the wheel a good balanced feel. And for the scroll wheel switch, inside we'll find another familiar component, as we'll find a taller pillar switch designed with a purple plunger. Sadly, I was unable to ID the specific manufacturer for these switch, but I assume it's a Kale SKU as they commonly manufacture these taller switch types, but it could also be made by TTC or Panasonic. But regardless of the manufacturer, since this is a pillar switch, the actuation weight of the scroll wheel click is on the heavier side, feeling akin to that of the side buttons being around 80 grams, and for travel, the switch does have a low degree of both pre and post travel, but as is tradition for a pillar switch, the rebound on the click is weaker than that of a traditional switch type, which gives the scroll wheel click a spongier feel, but this is to be expected as all pillar switches feel like this. For sensor, as expected for a ROG product, the Harpe II is using ROG's Aimpoint series sensor, the same sensor series we saw used on the Keras II Ace, but here on the Harpe II there have been some notable changes to the sensor and improvements made to the mouse's MCU as well. But before we talk about these improvements, let's talk about the sensor's positioning. Now as mentioned earlier, the mouse's sensor is uniquely positioned as it's located slightly behind the mouse's 63.05mm physical midline, resting at approximately the 61mm mark. This slightly lower positioning might slightly skew the mouse's feel initially, especially seeing as it's positioned quite behind the mouse's 67mm balancing point, but after a few days of use you'll get accustomed to the sensor's positioning just as you will its balancing. Now the mouse's sensor, as mentioned earlier, is an Aimpoint sensor, however the one here is the Pro version, but funnily enough the sensor itself is the same one we saw inside the Keras II Ace, just being a rebranded PAW 3950 series sensor, and the only difference gained by this Pro naming is that some of the sensor's features and parameters have been altered, slightly more so than the previous Aimpoint sensors. Now if you're wondering how I know this is just a renamed PixArt sensor, we can tell easily, as on the inside of the sensor lens we'll find a PixArt logo, just as we did on Razer's and every other brand's rebranded PixArt sensors. Now for the sensor specs, since this is technically a custom version of a 3950, the sensor specs do vary from a traditional 3950 sensor slightly, as the sensor supports a DPI range of 100 to 42,000, which is adjustable via 10 DPI steps, and it has an IPS rating of 750 3950 and an acceleration rating of 50 grams. For LOD levels, instead of the traditional 0.7, 1, and 2mm levels we see on most 3950 implementations, here the LOD levels are preset to low and high values, similar to what we see on Vaxi's 3950s, but ROG isn't advertising the ranges at which these two values track at, which is quite odd. The sensor also supports motion sync and angle snapping, but ripple has been disabled, which is another odd choice here given the sensor's max DPI. Another notable change here is that the sensor has been updated to finally support sensor tilting, a feature that was absent on ROG's previous mice. However, while I was happy to see this feature, I was very disappointed to find that the tiltable range was only 20 degrees, not the expected 33 degrees we find on all 3950s. But the most disappointing aspect here is that the sensor's angle isn't adjustable freely as it is on every other 3950 sensor, as for whatever reason, ROG has made it so you have to choose predefined values for the sensor tilts. This is a very confusing choice, as if users have an odd grip angle such as myself, you can't properly align the mouse's sensor. As such, while I'm happy to see sensor tilting finally supported on a ROG product, they absolutely need to rework their tilt implementation here to allow the sensor's angle to be freely set and widen the tilt range to this sensor's max of 33 degrees both positively and negatively. But thankfully, you can override ROG's questionable sensor tilt implementation here by utilizing RAW-Accel, as with that program, you can tilt the mouse's sensor or any mouse's sensor however you want, and if you want to learn more about what sensor tilting is and how it can drastically improve your aim and ergonomics, and learn how to apply it via RAW-Accel or your mouse's onboard controls, check out my full guide to sensor tilting, which will be linked on screen here and down in the video description. And for MCU, here we'll find another notable upgrade, as instead of using the Nordic NRF52840s we've seen ROG use in the past, here the Harpe II is using the brand new Nordic NRF54H20 MCU, the exact same MCU we found on the Death Adder V4 and many other recently released mice. This is a fantastic improvement, as these new Nordic SoCs are not only significantly more power efficient, which leads to improved runtimes on the mouse, they are also much faster, significantly improving the mouse's latency. Sadly though, ROG isn't advertising any latency specifics here for the Harpe II, but I will say over my testing I didn't notice any latency related issues despite this new MCU implementation. For connectivity types, the Harpe II supports 3 connectivity modes, which is a rare sight on a high-end gaming mouse, as in addition to the expected 2.4 GHz and USB-C connectivity types, the mouse also supports Bluetooth connectivity, and you can configure the connectivity mode via a slider on the mouse's base. For antenna, the mouse uses a traditional antenna design that is integrated into the mainboard. To be honest, I'm surprised ROG didn't go for a dedicated antenna design as Razer has done on their products, but regardless, the traditional antenna type used here is fine. But one great improvement here when it comes to the mouse's connectivity types is that the mouse supports dual 8K on both its 2.4 GHz and USB-C connectivity, something that is often lacking on many similarly priced gaming mice on the market. But while the mouse supports dual 8K, it's worth noting that on the Bluetooth connectivity, the report rate will be capped to 125 Hz, making this mode less than ideal for gaming use, but ideal for general use due to the decreased power consumption. And in addition to the unique connectivity modes, as we've seen on ROG's previous mice, the USB-C and 2.4 GHz connectivity modes' respective polling rates were very well implemented, and over my testing, both modes performed well, but I did notice that on the 2.4 GHz connectivity when using 4 or 8K polling, there was a slight instability that caused some larger than usual fluctuations. Thankfully, these never impacted the mouse's performance, but it's something I wanted to mention as we didn't see this slight polling rate instability on ROG's previous mice. For a battery, the Harpe II uses what I assume is a 300 mAh battery, as that is the size for most mice like this. I tried to confirm the battery's exact size, but since the battery is wrapped with a plastic film which is secured by these foam pads that are necessary for anchoring the battery, there was no way for me to remove the cover to figure out the battery's capacity without making it unreinstallable. But given the battery's dimensions and its weight, the battery is likely a 300 mAh type. This battery uses a 2mm JST PH connector, which as I mentioned mentioned earlier has glue applied to its cables in an effort to prevent them from coming loose, which is a nice attention to detail. ROG is advertising that the Harpe II's runtime on 1 kHz will be 101 hours with the lighting disabled and 84 hours with it enabled, but they're not advertising any runtimes for the mouse's other report rates, which is rather odd. But regardless, on my unit running firmware 8.00.11, set to its max DPI of 42,000, all the LEDs disabled, the auto sleep and power saving mode disabled, motion sync disabled, and set on a mouse jiggler to simulate usage. On 1 kHz, the mouse's runtime was approximately 110 hours. On 1 kHz again, but with the mouse's zone mode enabled, the mouse's runtime significantly decreased to a mere 35 hours. On 2K polling, the mouse's runtime was around 32 hours. On 4 kHz, the mouse's runtime was 30 hours, and on 8 kHz, the mouse's runtime was 19 hours. But keep in mind that enabling the mouse's lighting or utilizing the zone mode on any of the other report rates will significantly decrease the already low runtimes here. Now, while the mouse's runtimes are better than the runtimes we've seen on mice using the previous generation Nordic SoCs, compared to other mice using similar specs in the same 54H20 MCU, the runtimes here, specifically the 2, 4, and 8 kHz ones, are much lower than expected, being more akin to the runtimes of older mice on older SoCs. As such, while the runtimes will be fine for most use cases here, there is definitely a lot of room for improvement, as ROG definitely isn't fully utilizing its new SoC. And lastly, for charging, the mouse charges via its front-facing USB-C port, which despite its appearance is universal, meaning you can charge or use the mouse with most aftermarket cable types, but since the mouse's stock cable is already quite good, you likely won't need to use any aftermarket cables here on the Harpe II. Now, in addition to all the other improvements ROG has made here on the Harpe II, the mouse's software experience is arguably the most notable improvement, as on their previous releases, you were forced to use Armory Crate or Armory Crate gear to manage them, which was an interesting experience to say the least. But here, you are no longer tied to Armory Crate, as the mouse supports ROG's new GearLink WebDriver, which is very well implemented considering this is ROG's first crack at a web-based driver. Now, to access the WebDriver, you'll need to use a Chromium-based browser such as Chrome or Edge and navigate to the driver's URL, which will be linked down in the video description. Once on the page, then click the Connect button, select your mouse from the drop-down menu, click Connect, and you'll load into the driver. And once loaded in, the driver defaults to the button configuration tab. But before we talk about that, I wanted to highlight some driver-specific settings you can configure via the buttons in the top right here. Firstly, in the settings menu, you can change the driver's language and choose the driver's display mode. Here there is also a bulletin page which lists release notes and changelogs for the WebDriver and the mouse's firmware. Before that, we have an FAQ page which links to ASUS's respective support pages. And lastly, we have a rather unique diagnostics tab which you can use to troubleshoot the mouse, a great feature I wish more brands implemented to ease the troubleshooting process. Going back to the top right here and clicking the next button, we have a dedicated firmware update page in which you can download updates for both the mouse and driver, but the updates are manual, not automatic, but thankfully the installation process for said updates is quite easy. Lastly, we have a dedicated tab for the mouse's companion mode, which is an installable extension that allows for additional key rebind options here, as the mouse's onboard memory doesn't support macros and Windows shortcuts. As such, if you need these features, you'll need to install the companion, but these features are more utility focused and won't really be necessary for most gaming tasks. Circling back to the driver's main tab, at the top left here we have a dynamic battery indicator which reflects the mouse's charge or charging level. I would have loved to see an estimated runtime implemented here though, as if Vaxi can do it on their WebDriver, ROG absolutely could do so as well, and hopefully we'll see that added in the near future. Below that, we can select the mouse's onboard profile, of which the mouse supports 5, and you can switch between these profiles either via the WebDriver or by pressing the DPI and scroll wheel button at the same time. Below that, we'll find the Buttons tab, which is split into two modes, a primary and a secondary speed shift level, but to utilize the speed shift binds, you'll need to bind one of the mouse's default buttons to toggle into this mode. Now, without the companion extension, the rebind options here are limited slightly, but for gaming use, everything you need is here, and if you mess up on a rebind and need to reset them, you can do so by clicking the reset button at the top right, something you can do in every tab of the software, which is a great thing to see. In the next tab, called the Performance tab, we can adjust the mouse's DPI levels, of which the mouse supports 4, and you can also disable all but 2 of these levels and assign a color to each level's DPI as well, which will be reflected on the mouse's scroll wheel. Oddly though, there is no option to separate the X and Y axis DPI values, something I'd like to see ROG implement in the future. We can also enable or disable angle snapping, set the mouse's polling rate from 125Hz to 8000Hz on both the 2.4 GHz and wired USB-C connectivity types, and enable or disable motion sync. Lastly, for this tab, we can also adjust the mouse's sensor angle, which is a fantastic feature to see finally supported here. However, as mentioned earlier, you can only adjust it by 20 degrees both positively and negatively, and only to preset values, which is very disappointing, and hopefully ROG will remove the artificial limitations on this feature in the future and set it to be fully user customizable. Next, we have the Lighting tab, in which you can customize the scroll wheel's lighting effects, adjust its brightness, or disable it entirely. Next, we have the Calibration tab, in which you can calibrate the Harpe to either of ROG's mousepads, or you can manually calibrate it yourself. This supposedly calibrates the mouse's sensor to track more accurately on various surface types. However, just like every other implementation of this feature we've seen on other brands' products, I genuinely can't tell if it's doing anything beneficial, and in both the calibrated and uncalibrated modes, I never experienced any tracking related issues here on the Harpe, but if you find this feature useful, you can utilize it if needed. Aside from the calibration options in this tab, we can also select the mouse's LOD levels, but as mentioned earlier, the levels are preset to low and high, with no indication of what these values actually track at. Next, in the Power tab, we can adjust the Harpe's power settings, such as at what percentage the mouse enters power saving mode, which you can disable entirely thankfully, as well as adjust the power saving mode's effects, adjust the mouse's auto sleep timer for 1 to 10 minutes or never, and adjust some other lighting related power features. Next, we have a tab dedicated to the Harpe II Zone Mode feature, which according to ROG gets you straight into the zone by cutting straight to top tier hardware settings optimal for competitive gaming, reserving all performance power to what truly matters for the moment. In reality, and without this marketing mumbo jumbo, this mode is just a renamed competitive mode we've seen many brands adopt recently, which locks the sensor's frame rate to its max instead of the variable modes it operates at by default. But as is typical for these comp modes, in reality I didn't notice any difference between the mouse's feel with the zone mode enabled or disabled, aside from significantly increased power draw, and as such, and as I say every time I talk about these competitive modes, you'll be much better off just utilizing the mouse's 2-4 AK polling rates, as they are actually beneficial to a mouse's performance, whereas locking the sensor's frame rate only gives a marginal performance improvement. And lastly, we have another tab talking about the features of the companion mode, but we already talked about that. And just like ROG's previous releases, some of the Harpe's features such as polling rate, DPI profile, and zone mode can be controlled via the mouse's onboard controls, which in the past was the preferred method as Armory Crate was your only other option, but now that GearLink exists, I'd recommend using the WebDriver to manage the supported ROG products, as it is very well implemented, though it is missing a couple features. And as a last note, currently GearLink only supports the Harpe II Ace and the Keras II Origins, and ROG's previous mice such as the Keras II Ace are not compatible with the WebDriver, which is quite disappointing, and hopefully we'll see ROG update their older mice to make them compatible with the driver, as freeing their older products from the chains of Armory Crate would be a very beneficial change. For repairability, the Harpe II is a surprisingly serviceable mouse, however it isn't without its tricks, as there are several unique things inside the mouse you need to look out for when opening it. But regardless, the mouse is relatively easy to open, and once inside, to my surprise, every component inside the mouse is serviceable, even the main switches if you remove that glue holding them in place. The only exception to this being the side button switches as we mentioned earlier, which technically can be serviced, but it's very easy to damage the integrated cable. But aside from that, all the other components are easy to service, specifically the battery, which is a great attention to detail and something I honestly didn't expect to see on a ROG product. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to add a coating to the side buttons to make them grippier, it is relatively easy to remove the side buttons from the top shell, so painting or applying a coating to them is an easy task. And relubing the main click switches is also an easy task too, though you do have to disassemble the top shell to get to them. But if you're interested in learning more about the Harpe II's internal design, its component weights, modding options, and more, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the Harpe II's teardown video, which will be releasing very soon. For skates, the Harpe 2 includes a pre-installed set of ROG's 2.5D 100% PTFE skates and also includes an extra set of the same typing, which unlike the pre-installed ones, do come with a protective film over them, so be sure to remove this film if you plan on using them. These skates are quite different from the ones ROG has used on their previous releases in terms of their design, thickness, and curvature, which is a great improvement in my opinion. First, let's talk about the skate's shaping, as the skate's surface area are well balanced, with the base skate being slightly larger, but not in a way that will significantly affect the mouse's movements. The skate's edging has also been updated, as ROG is claiming the skate's 2.5D shaping reduces friction on movements. We've seen many other brands employ similar edging on their skates, and this combined with their 100% PTFE material does make the stock skates quite smooth and rather fast despite their larger surface area, which works quite well here with the Harpe's size and gives the mouse a very fast, agile feel and glide. But the biggest differentiating factor with these skates compared to the ones used on ROG's previous releases is that the skates here are dual layered, having a top layer of PTFE and a bottom layer of vinyl or plastic. We've seen other brands, most notably Razer, use a similar style of skate on the Viper V3 Pro and Death Adder V4 Pro, but their skates had a buffering layer between the skates layers, whereas here on the Harpe 2, there's nothing but adhesive between the skates. This dual layered nature does make removing these skates quite difficult, as not only are there no skate removal ramps in the mouse's base, the adhesive between the skates layers is very strong and when removed leaves behind a bunch of residue. But on the plus side, the stock skates do perform well, much better than the skates included with ROG's previous releases. However, I'd only recommend using these skates on soft pad types, as on hard pad types, the skate's 100% PTFE material will wear down very quickly, resulting in inconsistent performance. As such, if you plan on using the mouse on a hard pad, I'd highly recommend removing the mouse's stock skates and using a hard pad optimized aftermarket skate, something that the mouse oddly doesn't include given its price. For me, I used some of X-Ray Pad's U9 Ultra 8mm dots when I was testing the mouse on hard pads, and they perform great, but on a future version of the Harpe 2, they should absolutely include some kind of hard pad optimized skates with the mouse. Also on the topic of aftermarket skates, both the mouse's skate channels are wide and thin enough to allow for universal compatibility with aftermarket skates, but the raised ridges on said channels might cause some smaller surface area skates to be slightly tilted. This won't ever impact dot or donut skates usage as they have rounded surfaces to counteract this, but keep this in mind if you plan on using aftermarket skates here on the Harpe 2. And lastly, let's talk about the Harpe 2 stock cable, which as I mentioned earlier in this video is a familiar one as it's the same fantastic cable we saw included with the Harpe II Ace. For typing, this cable is the expected USB A to C type, which has a rather smooth paracord wrapping, which allows the cable to glide across soft and hard pad surfaces without too much drag or friction. The cable is also quite thin, much thinner than the cables we commonly see included with other brands' mice, which makes it very flexible and fully compatible with all bungee types. But sadly, the cable's USB-C end isn't tilted, which is something I wanted to see ROG implement when I talked about this cable last time. But regardless, this stock cable is without a doubt in my mind one of the best stock cables I've seen included with a mouse as of late, as its low friction wrapping and flexible design makes the Harpe 2's wired usage experience astronomically better than most of the competitors' products, on which you almost always need to rely on aftermarket cables to improve their wired usage. But while the cable is great, again it should have a tilted USB-C end, as that would make this cable perfect, but in its current form the cable is still very good, again much better than most competitors' offerings, but with a small change it could be perfect. Alright, in conclusion, overall I have to say ROG really has impressed me here with the Harpe II Ace, as given my experience with their previous products, this is a shocking improvement for them, so much so I kinda can't believe they're the one to release this mouse, as the mouse has a great semi-symmetrical shape, weight and build quality, a fantastic coating that rivals the best coating on the market, stellar main clicks which are technically hot swap which is great to see, the updated SoC is a welcome change, and the mouse's dual 8K support is great. The mouse's stock skates and stock cables are great, much better than expected, though the cable does still need a tilted USB-C end, and despite the more complex internal design, the mouse is still rather serviceable, and of course, ROG's new GearLink WebDriver is a massive improvement over the software experience on ROG's previous mice, and for this being ROG's first crack at a WebDriver, they've done a great job with it, even though it is missing a couple features. But while the mouse has many positives, there are still some areas where ROG could improve the mouse a little more, more here, as the mouse lacks skate removal ramps and doesn't include hard pad optimized skates, something that absolutely should be included with a mouse at this price point, and the new MCU, while being a great upgrade, isn't fully utilized, and there is some room to improve the mouse's power optimizations as its runtimes are a little underwhelming, specifically on the higher report rates. The sensor doesn't support split X and Y axis DPI values, and the sensor tilting implementation is very underwhelming as the range is lower than it should be and the tilt values are locked to predefined ones. And my biggest critique here is that the side buttons are not coated, which is a decision I'm just kind of dumbfounded on, and I don't know why they wouldn't apply the fantastic coating to the side buttons, as in their uncoated state, while they are usable, they are quite slippery. And lastly, my final issue with this unit is the price, as the mouse, while it is good, is very expensive, which makes the mouse hard to recommend compared to competitors' products, especially in the higher tier market, as people trust Razer and Logitech more than ROG given their history. But thankfully, pricing is something ROG can absolutely change, and it's a very good opportunity for them to undercut the market here, as the Harpe II Ace is overall a very solid mouse. Sure, it is missing a couple things, but with some firmware tweaks and better power optimizations, the mouse can easily compete against bigger brands like Logitech and Razer, and if they price the Harpe II slightly lower, I think ROG could cut a decent chunk out of the peripheral market away from their competitors. But regardless of the mouse's pros and cons, I have to give massive props to ROG, as they listened to feedback and made a mouse that is extremely good, and I can't wait to see what improvements ROG has made to their other mice such as the Keras 2 Origins, which I will be reviewing soon, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video and reviews of ROG's future peripheral releases. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching, and big thanks again to ROG for sending over the Harpe II Ace for review. And of course, a massive shout out to all of our channel members who make videos like this possible. If you would like to support my efforts on the channel with these in-depth reviews and the Teardown project, consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a channel member also gives you early access to all upcoming content, so if you enjoy the content, consider becoming a member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the ROG Harpe II Ace, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.